In this video, we're going to start Chapter 12, Development over the Lifespan. Now this chapter is quite a doozy of a chapter. It is fairly long and covers everything from conception through to death in terms of how humans develop and grow and mature as we age. So buckle up, we're in for quite the journey as we cover this chapter. But we're going to start at the very beginning by talking about developmental psychology as a field, because this is the area of psychology that actually studies our development. So we're going to look at changes in biological, physical, psychological, and behavioral processes over time. Basically, how are our bodies changing? How are our behaviors changing? What's going on as we get older? We can look at things like relative contributions of genes and our environment and how those contributions may change or interact in different ways as we get older. We're going to talk a little bit about some critical and sensitive periods. Critical period being sort of a cutoff age where experiences must have occurred by that point, and sensitive periods being sort of an optimal age range in which your ability to do something happens most goodly. That's not what I mean. Happens best. And we've already kind of talked about sensitive periods in terms of language learning. So same basic idea, but we're going to talk about it in terms of other kinds of learning as well. Now, in order to talk about how people change across a bunch of different metrics or measures over time, we actually have to measure people at multiple time periods over their lives. And there are a couple of different ways that psychologists, and specifically developmental psychologists, can go about trying to capture this kind of information from different human populations. And so we're going to talk about three of the core methods of setting up research on things that change over time for human lives. So we're going to look at cross-sectional, longitudinal, and sequential research designs. And each of those is going to get their own page where we'll talk a little bit about what they mean. So let's start with cross-sectional research designs. So if you're doing a cross-sectional design, you're going to basically measure a bunch of people of different ages at the exact same time, or as close to the same time as you can. It obviously takes a while to measure large numbers of people. But for example, if you wanted to do a cross-sectional design right now in 2020, you could send out a bunch of surveys and you could ask a bunch of questions of people who are 10 years old, people who are 20 years old, people who are 30 years old, and that would give you an idea of how people in those different age categories are going to differ in whatever it is that you're interested in. Now that's all well and good, and a lot of research will actually use a cross-sectional design because you only have to measure at one time point. So it's a little bit easier to manage. You don't have to wait around for long periods. You just hand out all of your surveys or conduct all of your interviews, and then you're done. But of course, there are some downsides to this. And the major issues that we care about are the fact that your different cohorts, and here in this developmental psychology field, cohort just refers to the fact that some people are born at the same time and all grow up together. So all of our 10-year-olds this year, they form a cohort that was born in 2010. So we would talk about them as a single cohort. But from that aside, the issue here is that our different cohorts grew up in different time periods. So the 10-year-olds were born in 2010 and grew up in that time period. 20-year-olds would have grown up or been born in 2000, 30-year-olds in 1990, and of course they're all going to be experiencing different things. So because of when they're born, they're going to have different experiences, different cultural experiences, different environmental experiences. A great example of this is technology. People who were born further back don't have the same exposure to technology. I always use the example of my sister and I. I have a sister who is 6 years younger than me, and she doesn't remember a time before having computers in the house, whereas I do. So we were in different cohorts and have different experiences just because we grew up in different time periods. We can also look at things like people who grew up in the Depression, any of the depressions, where there were financial problems and social problems, and that can influence all sorts of different aspects of your people that you're studying. And so we run into this issue where, because these cohorts have all grown up in different time periods, if you find a difference between your 10-year-olds, your 20-year-olds, and your 30-year-olds, is that due to age differences, or is it due to differences in the time period that they grew up in? Is it due to different environments? Is it due to different experiences? Is it due to different cultures? Because of all of these potential confounds, because of all of these other variables that might be responsible, we can't look at cross-sectional research designs and look at the results from those and automatically assume that the differences that we're seeing are only due to age. There could be something else going on. And that's why we have other kinds of research designs. So we can look at our second type of research design, which is called a longitudinal research design. And this is one that's going to help us get over that problem of the fact that in our cross-sectional research design, you're testing multiple cohorts at the same time. We're going to do kind of the opposite here. And in longitudinal research, you test the same cohort at different times. So you would follow a group of individuals, a cohort, who were born in 1990. And you could survey them in 2000 when they were 10. You could survey them in 2010 when they are 20. And you could survey them in 2020 when they are 30. So you're following this same group of people, this same cohort, at multiple times throughout their lives. So you don't run into the issue of changing environmental and experiential things because of growing up in different time periods, because they all grow up together in the same time period. And of course, you see it coming. There are a bunch of issues that come along with this kind of research design. A major one is the fact that this is time consuming. Even from this one brief study that I've described, you have to follow people for at least 20 years. So that's very time consuming. You have to wait 20 plus years for your research to come out. Over that time, you also run into other issues. People drop out, people move away, people are no longer interested in your study, people may die. So your population at the beginning is going to be very different from the population 20 years later. And imagine if you're trying to do a longitudinal research study that's going to span from birth to death. Then you have to wait an entire human lifetime to collect all of that data. So the more you want to look at, the more time periods you want to investigate, the longer you have to wait. And we also run into sort of a logical problem here where we are finding changes as these people age, but now we want to ask, are these changes generalizable to all people as they age, or is it something that's specific to this particular cohort? So are there environmental or cultural or experiential factors that were specific to this group growing up that might not allow us to generalize our findings to other people who belong to other cohorts? So, of course, now we have our last type of research design, and this is the sequential research design. And this design basically combines the best scenarios of both cross-sectional and longitudinal research. So sequential research is going to look at several cohorts as they age. So in 2010, you could survey 10-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds. Or in 2000, 10-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds. In 2010, you could survey, actually, you'd probably want to, in fact, survey the same people again, I didn't really shift these numbers, but this would be 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, because everyone's now 10 years older. And then 2020, you'd be looking at 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 50-year-olds. So following multiple cohorts across time periods. A little bit cross-sectional because you're measuring multiple cohorts at one point, but also a little bit longitudinal because you're following the same cohort across time. And this helps us avoid the issues of both cross-sectional and longitudinal designs because they each kind of help us figure out what's going on. So we're not concerned that it's something to do with this particular cohort because we're looking at multiple cohorts. We're not concerned about it being something that's going to be not captured in a single measurement because we're doing multiple measurements. It's kind of the best case scenario. Again, we run into the issue of it is time consuming. It's going to take many years to follow all of these people over long periods of time. It's also more surveys. So sometimes it's not feasible to use a sequential research design, but it is one of the best options that you can have when trying to conduct developmental psychology research. And as per my usual, I have a visual for people who like visual representations. We can look at our cross-sectional design here. So we're saying, I guess we'll take a step back and look at this graph where we have the age at the time of testing. So how old are our participants when we're testing them? And here we have the year that the testing is conducted. So for a cross-sectional design, they would measure only in the year 2011, and they're getting people who are 10 years old, 30 years old, and 50 years old. And so that's the cross-sectional. For our longitudinal, that is this line here, where you would be measuring a group, the same person, who is 10 years old in 2011, who is 20 years old in 2031, and who is 50 years old in 2051. And then if we wanted to do our sequential, we would be looking at 3 people in 2011, and then here in 2031, we'd actually be looking at 3 people again who have sort of scaled up in age. So we go from 10, 30, 50 to 20, 40, 60, and so on and so forth. So that's how we could use those different types of studies and sort of what they look like in terms of who we're studying and when.